I'm going to be looking at the supernatural in a slightly different angle, but very much sort of linked to some of the things that Jack was talking about today. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at visiting places associated with the supernatural, and I think what's interesting about this is the relationship that people form with places, whether that is belief driven or sort of an interest in the storytelling that happens in those places. And what I want to sort of get to as we go through the talk today is just to think about some of the opportunities that there are for engagement with the supernatural, and as a result of that, engagement in sort of more sustainable practices, but also some of the challenges as well. So supernatural tourism, paranormal tourism is very popular these days, and we'll go into talk a little bit more about what we mean by that. And that brings with it some opportunities and some challenges as well. So I just want to talk about that, and then maybe have a bit of a think about how we can take those ideas in terms of thinking about how we can tackle this in a more sustainable way. So you're probably all aware of the kind of things that you might partake in when we think about supernatural tourism. So Jack's probably touched upon things like ghost walks day, or experiences that people pay to go on in terms of hearing about supernatural stories. Ghosts are probably one of the key areas that's been commodified in terms of tourism. So you go to somewhere like the city of York, and when I lived down there, that's where I did my PhD. There was 14 ghost walks which were operating at the time. It was called the Ghost Wars because there were so many of them operating in such a small area of the city. And they obviously take people around a place, telling stories, engaging with the kind of dark history and heritage and the kind of supernatural elements of those places as well. And a little bit like this kind of spectrum or continuum of the paranormal that we've mentioned across this talk and the discussion earlier, in terms of what we might constitute to be forms of supernatural tourism, there's a bit of a continuum to that as well. So whilst we might have things like ghost walks or Bigfoot hunting or UFO tourism, where we're sort of dealing with these more sort of creatures of the supernatural, we also get the sort of other end of it, such as Mother Shipton's cave, which is obviously based on Mother Shipton and her prophecies, and the petrified well, or the objects which are turned to stone. So we see this kind of different level of engagement with the supernatural across different types of tourism. And the supernatural is being used as a form of placemaking for destinations as well. So the UK, the USA tends to draw quite a lot on its ghost history up here in Scotland. A lot of Edinburgh, for instance, draws very heavily on the ghosts as a way of selling and bringing people to Edinburgh as a destination. But we see it in other parts of the world as well. Jack was, talking about places that seem to be a sort of mecca for supernatural things going on. And the Roswell incident is one of those moments in time, I suppose, that has then led to various forms of placemaking and various forms of tourism that have emerged from that. So in terms of Roswell, although the incident happened back in the 40s, we saw the kind of first tourism attractions emerging in the early 90s. And that really followed the publication of the book The Roswell Incident in 1980. And then from then we saw attractions such as the International UFO Museum and Research Centre, which formed in Roswell, and also the first UFO Festival, which happened in Roswell, which is in 1997. And that was hugely popular, attracted over 47,000 people, and it's still sort of happening to this day. So Roswell became a place that wasn't really known for anything to do with the supernatural until its association with the Roswell incident, and from that it's had this huge development around UFO tourism, which has come from that, and obviously then contributed to the way that people come to see Roswell and the reasons people might travel there. Another very clear example of that is in Romania and Transylvania, where we have the myth associated with Dracula. And again, whilst Bram Stoker, published his book in the sort of late 1800s, it wasn't really coming into the late 1900s that we started to see tourism in Romania and in Transylvania specifically emerging, and that was really after the publication of the book In Search of Dracula, 1972, which made the connection between the Dracula myth and Transylvania as a place, and that then encouraged people to start traveling to Transylvania in search of this character Dracula and the various sort of vampire folklore which emerged from that. And I think it's important to say, there's some interesting articles around this in relation to the response to that from the local community, who were quite resistant to that association with vampires and with the supernatural, and then the push towards trying to use that as a form of placemaking and tourism within the area. So we're going to touch on this a little bit more, but sometimes there can be that conflict between the local community and the visiting community and the kind of destination marketing organizations and how they decide to sell a destination based on its sort of supernatural attraction. So that's kind of broadly what we're talking about when we think about supernatural tourism, is really all of these elements that Jack's been touching upon in terms of what the paranormal is, but thinking about it in relation to places using those myths and legends and folklore to bring people to a particular place to engage with that. And I guess the reason that these stories become important for a place is because they bring various impacts. So we mentioned about Roswell in terms of the amount of people that travel to the festival, but looking at the kind of four pillars of sustainability, folklore for places can bring economic impacts in terms of the amount of money that's brought into a place. It can have cultural impacts in terms of sharing the heritage, the history, sometimes difficult histories connected to places. It can have social impacts in terms of providing collective experiences, bringing people together that have similar interests, whether that's paranormal interests or just indeed bringing people together to share an experience. And then there can be environmental impacts as well in terms of changing the way that people might see an environment based on the supernatural lore that's attached to it. So we're going to come back to that a little bit later as we go through. But I like this quote from Donald Smith, who's a director of Scottish International Storytelling Festivals, said that these stories matter because they bring us closer to the natural world. Shared centuries of human endeavour and to sustaining values, never has the world had so much need for such stories. So supernatural storytelling can be really, really important in terms of what it means to people and what it means to the places that those stories inhabit as well. Okay, so just so I'm moving my little thing around. I probably should just minimize it. There we go, that's better. Okay, so the picture of Nessie, which you mentioned, I do speak quite a lot in relation to the Scottish context here because it's the one I'm sort of most familiar with. But just to kind of, I suppose, highlight those pillars of sustainability in relation to one particular phenomenon, which is Nessie up here in Loch Ness Monster. In a similar vein to Roswell, the Loch Ness Monster has obviously become a sort of iconic key figure of not only that part of Scotland, but Scotland as a whole. It attracts a significant amount of people to Scotland on a yearly basis. So according to statistics, 350,000 visitors in 2015. And the annual figure of about 41 million to the local economy. So that's obviously people visiting the various attractions and experiences that enable you to engage with the possibility of seeing Nessie, but also the local restaurants, the hotels, and that kind of indirect impact that these stories and folklore have within the local region. And going back to the sort of ecological side of things and thinking about the environment, one of the other important things that Nessie has done as a kind of magical animal, and coming back to Holmes and the study which Jack was talking about earlier, that conservationists should take mythical animals seriously, and largely that's because people change their behaviour and change the way that they think about the environment and interact with the environments, occasionally based on these kind of mythical animals. So the Loch Ness, or Loch Ness itself as an environment, because of the monster, has had various sort of initiatives around preserving that particular area, preserving the story, and sort of conservation efforts around it too. So Nessie's not just there as a an interesting story, it also has these kind of wider implications for the local environment as well. Okay, so I thought I would touch on why people might take part in supernatural tourism, and I think that's important because understanding why people might take part in it also allows us to think about how we could potentially engage with that when we're thinking about moving towards sustainable practices, and how we could potentially tap into that. So there are a variety, an eclectic range of reasons that the research suggests people take part in supernatural tourism. For some, that could be a kind of authenticating act. So either the desire to potentially see a ghost, or perhaps they've had an experience themselves at some point, and the ability to have that experience with other people, to talk about that experience, or to hear about other experiences can be, I suppose, fulfilling, can be helpful in terms of understanding your own experience yourself. And as Jack has sort of said, a lot of people have these experiences, but there is a sort of stigma associated with them. We tend to see this quite a lot, particularly with sort of ghost hunting communities, and the ability to take part in those kind of activities with other people can enable that kind of sharing of individual experiences with a collective group. And this kind of links to some of the research that's been done around the sort of spiritual quest culture. So this notion that we've moved away perhaps from engaging with traditional religion and moved more to a space where there's a sort of bric-a-brac style approach to spirituality, where we're perhaps taking certain aspects of spirituality to build our own engagement with spirituality. And these sort of forms of tourism, whether that be going on a ghost walk or a ghost hunt, or perhaps going to see if you can find Bigfoot or Nessie, are sort of short-term ways of engaging with spirituality that might feed into this desire to consume spirituality in a slightly different way to how we have done previously. I guess that's, it's the interesting thing with supernatural tourism is it's not perhaps got the same level of investment in terms of time as obviously traditional religion and maybe traditional spirituality will have. So it's much more transitional in that sense between our day-to-day lives and popping into these moments of spirituality through the experiences that are provided. They can allow us to encounter places in different ways, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in terms of how the supernatural can help us to see places differently. But these sort of supernatural stories, or the potential to have supernatural experiences, can add a layer to a place which is different perhaps to what we would normally see and how we'd normally engage with place, whether that's through history or other forms of perhaps education in terms of how we would understand place. The paranormal also allows that engagement in terms of suspending perhaps our rational, maybe even everyday thinking, and engaging with possibility. And I think possibility is often spoken about in the literature around paranormal tourism as being a key reason for, or key draw to taking part in the supernatural. I had a guest speaker in just a couple of days ago speaking about dark tourism, which is tourism to places associated with death, suffering, and the sort of macabre aspects of our world. And he had gone to go and see if he could see Nessie as part of his new book. It's one of the chapters in his new book. And one of the things he was talking about is, while he didn't necessarily believe that he was going to see Nessie, he was very much engaged in that idea that he might. There was a possibility that he could. And that allows him for that moment to suspend his sort of rational thinking and I suppose play with the idea of the potential for the supernatural. I suppose that links into the next point here of this idea of enchantment in a disenchanted world, the notion that we live in a much more rational, sort of disenchanted society, and actually these supernatural encounters through tourism might provide that moment of enchantment that can perhaps lead us to think in slightly different ways. So, I like this quote by McEwen. It says, "Enchantment can be a state in which ghost spirits and spectres exist within a melange of the marvels, including magic, myth, monsters, witchcraft, sorcery, voodoo, vampires, and zombies. Such marvels are no longer thought to have been exercised by the rational and secular process of modernity. Far from being extraneous to modernity, they are intrinsic to what are increasingly recognised as thoroughly enchanted modernities." So there's this sense of potentially seeking enchantment in our contemporary society through these kind of experiences. I suppose that links into popular culture as well, and Jack's touched quite a bit along that. Supernatural tourism has absolutely been popularized through popular culture, whether that's ghost hunting TV shows leading to then people going and taking part in ghost hunting within haunted buildings, through to searches for Bigfoot and Nessie and these kind of things as well. So I suppose just to kind of extend this a little bit in terms of thinking about what the role of supernatural tourism might be for places, and for the communities and the sort of local tourism bodies. There's no denying that it's often marketed as being entertaining. It can enliven a place, it can add that sort of fun and thrill, and often the promotional materials around these activities tend to play upon that narrative. But they do also provide this potential for contemplation, I suppose, and exploration, because they present these sort of liminal spaces, like we spoke about before. They're sites where we have this kind of opportunity to engage with between our ordinary lives and the extraordinary, hearing stories, the possibility that we might encounter something that we wouldn't in our everyday lives. I think this is important because it allows us to maybe contemplate things that we maybe wouldn't think about in our everyday lives, and potentially can also lead to us maybe changing our behavior or our way of thinking, whether that be belief, spirituality, or potentially ecologically. And it can change our understanding of place as well. So a lot of the research in the supernatural tourism field has largely been around ghosts, and often ghost stories lead us to kind of contemplate the past. They're often linked to our sort of social memory. They're often politically, religiously charged. And as Hanks speaks about, they offer this kind of backstage glance into a place. So that opportunity, I suppose, to see almost the dirty laundry of a place that we maybe wouldn't normally hear about or think about, or is offered to us in the kind of standard tourism narrative. So we often hear about the kind of darker heritage or the difficult heritage of a place. And it can also encourage, I suppose, engagement with history and heritage in ways that normal history maybe wouldn't allow for. So Malky speaks about the kind of mythical history, so the combination of myth and history. Now that has challenges associated with it in terms of sort of fragmentation of historical narratives, but at the same time it can be more attractive perhaps to hear about the history of a place through storytelling rather than through the sort of factual elements of it. Offers that different experience of place, fills everyday spaces with the kind of stories, tales, and legends. So as I said before, that kind of layer on top of just the sort of factual information. And there is the potential there through the creation of these kind of liminal spaces, these opportunities to engage in possibility, to be enchanted, to potentially change behavior in these spaces as well, to engage people in narratives around the environment, around the place, and around the way that we interact with the world, whether that be through the physical world or through the sort of supernatural world as well. And again, I'll come back to that. So I suppose bearing those things in mind, I just want to touch upon the kind of opportunities and the challenges. I'm just checking the time, that's good, around folklore and the paranormal and sustainability. So if, as we've sort of said, things like supernatural tourism allow us to see places differently. There is the potential then for us to think about the different ways that we engage with those places. So, for instance, if a bluebell field is set out in front of us as just being a bluebell field, is as beautiful as it might be, if you then suddenly layer upon that the stories of fairies inhabiting the bluebell fields, or there being some kind of supernatural sacred component to that, there is a potential that by seeing that differently, we potentially change our behavior to interact with that environment in a slightly different way. We might not go trampling through a bluebell field if we feel that there is, the potential for interfering with those sacred environments as well. That sort of engagement with history and heritage and place in new ways also enables engagement with a difficult past, and I suppose thinking about the future. And by engaging with those difficult parts of our history, thinking about how we can ensure that those things don't happen again going forwards, and creating more sustainable ways of thinking about the future. And I've mentioned a little bit about the sort of the enchantment there too. And in terms of change of behavior, we see this. We see examples of people's behavior changing because of the supernatural components of the landscape, and the desire for people to perhaps visit these places but not interfere with them. So I'm sure some of you have heard some of these stories, such as I think it was 2013. There was a sort of campaign around not building a road in Iceland because it interfered with the Hoodoo folk, or the hidden people in Iceland, so the attachment to elves. So there's been very real examples of where the landscape and place has been preserved because of these forms of supernatural, I suppose, associations, and people not wanting to interfere with those places. And folktales, I mentioned this a little bit before, can have a sort of educational value to them, to help encourage people to engage with landscape and engage with history that more standard historic narratives might not. They add a sort of personality to landscapes that can promote more sustainable behavior. And they can also encourage exploration of places in slightly different ways, whereas sort of more traditional forms of tourism require sort of infrastructure to be able to engage with them. Stories about the landscape, and supernatural stories in particular that have that sort of invisible components, can enliven landscapes in ways that doesn't necessarily require that sort of tourism infrastructure. So I wanted to share with you, this was a project I was involved with about 4 years ago now, called the Orkney Folklore Trail. And this was up on the Orkney Isles, and we worked with a local storyteller. One of the big challenges that Orkney has, which you might be aware of, is a sustainability issue with tourism. So particularly their cruise ships, they have about 170 cruise ships that turn up to Orkney each year, and there's thousands of people that go on these ships and then end up descending into Orkney, particularly to some of the hotspots. So things like the Ring of Brodgar, the Stones of Stennis, which are heritage sites, but they're very exposed heritage sites. There's not a lot of tourism infrastructure there. So there's a lot of environmental degradation and ecological issues that arise from this kind of mass tourism which occurs on the islands. So we worked with two storytellers who were an amazing Tom Muir, who's got this incredible sort of background in folklore. He's born and bred Orcadian, and just knows all these amazing stories about Orkney. And we wanted to try and take people away from those hotspots that were being damaged by the volume of tourism that was being sent to them, and try and take people to different parts of Orkney where they could enjoy hearing about these folklore stories in landscapes that had no tourism infrastructure. So we created a mobile application that takes people to 10 different locations around Orkney. It's GPS based, so when you arrive at the location, the story pops up for you. And some locations have sort of multiple stories in addition to the the folklore story itself, there's various information around things that you can do in the local area, little shops. And so we wanted the sustainability to go beyond the kind of drawing people away from places, but also into the community as well, and trying to encourage that kind of economic sustainability as well as the environmental. You can then sort of stand in the location where that story is being told, and look out into the landscape and listen to the story itself. And you can, the stories have been very much developed to encourage you to look to certain pieces and places in the land and to think about the story that's being told. What I thought I would do, I'm going to try and share one of the stories with you. Hopefully this will work, Jack. Let me know if you're not hearing it. I have said share sound, so we'll see. So this is one of the fairy stories from Orkney, which very much links to one aspect of the landscape to another.
Scale House is known as one of the most haunted houses in Orkney, but it's not the only haunted place at the Bay of Scale. St Peter's Kirk over...
I'm just going to say it wasn't the fairy story, it was the ghost story I put in there. I'm going to play it. Sorry, apologies about that.
On your right, as you're facing the sea, also has a ghost story. A long time ago, a baby died of a fever that was spreading through the area. As the baby boy hadn't been christened, the minister refused to bury it in the kirkyard. But it was winter time, and there was a blanket of snow on the ground. So, under the cover of darkness, the man buried his bairn in the kirkyard. No one knew until the snow melted and the disturbed soil could be seen. The minister knew what had happened, but didn't have the heart or the stomach to dig up the tiny corpse. It was soon after that the hauntings began. The ghost of a small child was seen sitting crying on the sloping ground just behind the kirk. The cattle were afraid to graze in the field, and the local people were equally frightened of it. After a time, one man decided to talk to the restless spirit to see why it remained there. So, one evening, he went to the spot where the baby haunted, and he saw it there crying piteously. "What's wrong with you, bareback?" he asked, and with that the baby's ghost disappeared. It had been given a name, Bareback, and could now rest in peace. It's more than 100 years since that story was published in the local newspaper, and I suspect that it has been sanitized as another version of that story, as the man calling the weeping baby Bear Arse.
So that was just one of the stories from the Folklore Trail. And one of the things that we tried to do, I suppose, was try and capture some of the, interesting stories that relate to the history and heritage of Orkney as well. So obviously in that story, there was the connections to the kind of religious undertones of who could and couldn't be buried based on their religion. The fairy story that I thought was the one that I had on there, but I think I changed it because it was a longer one, the fairy one. Was very much about the fairies and the superstitions of Orkney being driven out by Christianity coming to the islands. So a lot of the stories are kind of reflective of that. This app is available now. Actually, you can go to Orkney and visit it. But what we've noticed with this is just being able to drive people to different places to engage with these kind of destinations that they wouldn't normally go to. So the story that the baby ghost is from is just a small kirk just off the kind of main route from Orkney that hardly anyone ever goes to because it's not got any infrastructure there to support tourism. But the story itself provides that kind of different perspective of the landscape. So there are opportunities in terms of taking people to different places, to engage with the place in different ways, and also engaging with the heritage of a location in ways that we maybe wouldn't with with normal kind of traditional tourism. But there are some significant challenges with folklore as well. And this, I suppose, links back to the paper that Jack was talking about in relation to magical animals, that, you know, there are occasions where magical animals can help with preservation and conservation, but there's also times when actually, because of the associations, the superstitions that form around those magical animals, that can actually hinder conservation, because those animals are killed, or because there's a concern or there's a fear attached to it. We also see this with environmental damage, ecological damage. So I mentioned about Orkney in terms of the stones of Stennis. One of the key locations for me where I've seen this happen, I used to live on the Isle of Skye in Scotland. There's a place called the Fairy Glen up there, which is a sort of miniature landscape. It's what you can see on the slide there at the moment. And when I lived there, it was a very quiet place. You could go and walk your dog. There was no tourists. It was, it's a very small place. It doesn't take you long to kind of wander around. And then really in the last 10 years, as a result of social media, as a result of film tourism as well, there's been a lot more tourists going to Skye, and like Orkney, it's suffering from volume tourism. And the Fairy Glen, although it's called the Fairy Glen, doesn't actually have any folklore attached to it. It's simply because of the landscape and what the landscape looks like. There are fairy stories on Skye, but those are largely kind of Dunvegan and other areas of the island. But what has happened in Skye is, because it's such a beautiful landscape, the Fairy Glen, and quite unusual, tour guides have been taking tourists to the Fairy Glen and then getting them to perform various rituals to appease the fairies. And as a result of that, these kind of folklore stories have emerged just in the last kind of 10 to 12 years in that place. And if you go to the Fairy Glen now, you can look at images online as well. It's a very different landscape to what it was when I lived there 15 years ago. There's lots of cairns. People put highlighter pens on the cairns. They've created these kind of stone circles. So the picture you can see there is an image that I took when I went about 6 years ago. And it's one of the tour guides asking the visitors to walk backwards around the stone circle and drop stones to create, to sort of appease the fairies and to bring them good luck. So again, this is new folklore that's emerged, and it's caused a lot of tension with the local community because their local landscape's been changed, and obviously there's additional community concerns there as well in terms of very small roads with lots of people congesting those too. So there's actually a community group that go in and clear up all of this kind of tourism litter, I suppose, that's being created to try and take the natural environment back to what it was at the end of each of the tourist seasons. So we do see these issues. In addition to that, there's often backlash. I mentioned in relation to Transylvania about the local community, and when the tourism body in Transylvania was looking to develop the Dracula narrative and try and use that as a form of tourism, which obviously was successful for them. There was real concerns from the local community about how they would be portrayed to the outside world. They saw Vlad Tepes as a local hero, which was very different to the way that he was being portrayed in terms of the character of Dracula. So this led to a conflict of identity versus economy, how the community wanted to be seen compared to the way that the local tourism agencies wanted to sell destinations based on their folklore. And we see this in lots of places when certain stories are being developed as part of a narrative. There's also concerns around authenticity. So in a similar way to the Fairy Glen, where stories have been recreated, there is a fragmentation of history and heritage that can occur when we bring folklore stories into the narrative. I heard a great quote at a conference a number of years ago that said that ghost hunting creates ghosts. And I think that's absolutely true. When people go on ghost hunting and things like that, they tend to have their own experiences, and those experiences kind of layer up on top of the previous, maybe more historical supernatural experiences that have occurred in those places, and that creates a new narrative on top of it. So authenticity can become lost and molded and evolve in places, and again, that can be detrimental in its own right. And the Orkney Folklore Trail that I was speaking about, we had to select that folklore, and that was very much community driven. It came from the local storytellers, but I was very conscious of the fact that we have 10 stops, so there's probably 20 stories which are told throughout that folklore trail. But as with any ghost walking tour or wider supernatural tour, we do get this selection of various folklore narratives, and often those are chosen because they are the most engaging ones of that place, but they don't fully represent that community and the heritage of that place as well. And then when you take these stories and you put them into an experience, there is the potential that that sort of becomes frozen as that particular narrative, and we lose that kind of traditional storytelling where perhaps stories will evolve as they become part of a kind of community's heritage. So these are just some of the sort of challenges, I suppose, that come with using folklore in these contexts. So one of the things that I suppose tried to think about, and one of the papers that I've written, and what we speak a little about in the book that we're publishing at the moment, is the idea that actually when tourism development is happening, it needs to really think about folklore at the heart of that tourism destination or tourism development strategy. Folklore can have this dual role. It can be preserving, but it can be damaging to the local ecology and the local environment, as well as the local community. And because of that, the community need to be involved in those conversations about how folklore is going to be used and how that's going to impact the kind of identity of the local community and the local place. But likewise, folklore has this ability to personify certain aspects of the environment, this kind of animism. And that actually can be a very positive thing. We spoke about the sort of bluebell fields, or perhaps not wanting to intrude upon land because there is this sense, like the Huldufólk in Iceland, that there may be supernatural creatures or supernatural entities that inhabit those spaces that will be impacted by those activities. That can potentially offer a different perspective to tourists who often go to those spaces with very much a consumption-based gaze. They're going to these places to consume those places, to take the selfie, to leave. Whereas if we bring in a slightly different perspective that has folklore at its heart, then that might encourage people to see places in slightly different ways. The stone at the top there, and that you can see Tim taking a photograph of, is one of the stones in Orkney that supposedly comes to life at New Year or Hogmay up here, and it bounces down to the sea to take a drink of water, and then it bounces back up the hill. And supposedly the story goes that if you see the stone bouncing across the land, then it will squash you and you'll die. So it's not a very nice stone, but it sort of captures the idea of animism, I suppose, in its perspective. And because that stone's got personality, or it has that sort of personhood attached to it, it's preserved. As you can see, there's there's a fence that's put around it. So there's that sort of quality of preservation because the stone has this association with it. So I suppose just to kind of summarize, why is sustainability relevant when we think about supernatural tourism? Well, people behave in places, or how they behave in places can be influenced by the stories that are connected to them, whether that be the Fairy Glen, the Loon Lake cemetery, which there are some sort of negative issues in relation to the cemetery being destroyed or vandalized because of the witch-based folklore which is attached to that. The Fortingal yew tree, people take souvenirs from the tree because they believe it has magical qualities. So we need to kind of understand how people behave in these spaces based on those stories, to then be able to think about how we can encourage more sustainable behaviours. These stories are used in placemaking and to reinvigorate tourism, so they're popular. They're something people want to engage with. And as Jack was saying towards the start of his talk, if there is an opportunity to integrate something around supernatural belief and supernatural experience and supernatural stories with potentially positive ecological or environmental behaviour, then there's a real opportunity there to make a difference. And understanding those kind of challenges and opportunities of folklore is really important for developing a more sustainable future. So just to conclude, we're at a critical point in time where our responsibility to and relationship with the natural world requires immediate reflection. Supernatural folktales have a long history of weaving the mythical and natural to connect us to the world, and by enchanting everyday spaces with extraordinary possibilities, these stories have influenced the way we see, experience, and behave in certain spaces. As scholars, it's perhaps time that we explore how folktales can connect us to our contemporary world and build a pathway to a more sustainable and enchanted future.